Streaming from Oklahoma's own digital studio, this is Beyond the Bell, brought to you by the Oklahoma Education Impact Initiative.
Welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Bell. Happy New Year. I'm Tatum Gwynn. Be prepared to hear a lot about early literacy in Oklahoma's upcoming legislative session. Lawmakers are looking closely at how reading is taught, when students should be intervened with, and what happens when they fall behind. It also happens to be one of State Superintendent Lyndall Field's priorities. Oh, and one phrase that you're going to keep hearing coming up in a lot of these conversations is the Mississippi Miracle. It's being held up as proof that large-scale reading gains are possible when states commit to evidence-based literacy policies. Today, we are breaking down what that actually means, what Oklahoma has already done, and what lawmakers are considering next. A familiar voice on Beyond the Bell is Oklahoma's Secretary of Education, Dr. Dan Hamlin, one of the state's leading experts on education policy, to help us separate the evidence from just talking points and explain what really works when it comes to teaching kids to read. Dr. Hamlin, thank you so much for coming on today. Let's set the stage. A lot of people and organizations within the state are talking about the Mississippi Miracle. At a high level, what actually happened in Mississippi, and why did those gains surprise so many people?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's good to be back with you to talk about education policy. I think what the Mississippi Miracle broadly refers to is a series of early literacy policies that were implemented in Mississippi around 2013. And then following from those early literacy policies were really dramatic gains in student achievement in that state, especially related to reading. Early literacy policies, they translated into better reading outcomes. So around that time, if you look back to 2013, and you look at the nation's report card, or the National Assessment for Educational Progress, that's a rigorous test that students in all states take. Mississippi ranked 49th in the country at that time. So Mississippi, by income, it is typically considered one of the poorest states, and traditionally has been by far and away one of the lowest achieving states in the country. And in 2013, before its early literacy push got started, it was ranked 49th. Today, so fast forward to today, Mississippi in fourth grade reading is ranked in the top 10 in the country. Now they don't spend, they spend maybe a little bit more than other southern states, but not much. Their spending is about comparable, but their early literacy policy is what has been a big change. Now, people will refer to this as a miracle. I think that could be a misnomer because it almost suggests that something just happened overnight and now their gains, that right. This all translated into great academic achievement. The reality is this has been a multi-year push to try to improve outcomes in that state. And I think a lot of people, if you talk to national experts on this, they'll actually refer to it as the Mississippi Marathon, to emphasize the fact that this is something that was ongoing. Yeah, that's right.
Is there risk of oversimplifying what Mississippi was able to do, assuming we can just copy and paste exactly what they did there? This worked for them. Hey, it's got to work for us. That's not necessarily how policy creating it, getting it established and passed. That's not necessarily how it works.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think that's a very real risk, that you could look at the package of policies that Mississippi implemented and say, well, okay, they had a third grade retention mandate, or they mandated that teacher preparation programs train teachers in the science of reading, or any number of policies, and say, well, we'll just do that here. But oftentimes the devil's in the details. Mm-hmm. That along, for example, with a third grade retention mandate, meaning that students would have to be proficient in reading in Mississippi in order to pass to the next grade, there were a lot of other supports and a lot of other pieces that went along with that. So I think it is really important to understand the different package of policies that were implemented there, but then all of the pieces, all of the mechanisms that were underlying that to actually make those policies be effective, really important. So I think there is a very real risk there.
So let's zoom in and look at Oklahoma. When we talk about early literacy, adopting some of those policies, there's a term that people will hear a lot. It's the science of reading. What is that?
Yeah, this is great. Also, great question. So I think a lot of people will think of the science of reading as phonics. And phonics is a very big part of what the science of reading is. But really, I think the way to think about it is it's not just phonics, but it's also spelling, it's comprehension, it's doing read-alouds with children. So there's multiple parts of the science of reading, although I think phonics is a big one. And then it also refers to a body of knowledge that's actually accumulated really now over several decades, rigorous experimental studies that show that using evidence-based or science of reading-based practices to teach reading is the best way to do it, and that children who don't get science of reading informed practices when they're learning just don't do as well and actually do much more poorly than their peers. And this really kind of goes back. I mean, there's the so-called reading wars that occurred for decades, and where you had a group of people who said, actually, we're more in favor of a whole language or balanced literacy approach to teaching reading, where students would look at a sentence and try to look at visual cues or look at words in the sentence to guess what a word might be, rather than trying to figure out what the letters, trying to sound out the letters and figure out how letters fit together to make sounds. So that approach was salient in the United States for a very long time. Some people attribute that approach to poor reading outcomes, but now there's sort of this new consensus that's been built up based in the literature that says we really have to have these more evidence-informed practices in order to be able to teach reading effectively. And so you're seeing states around the country start to implement these early literacy policies, and in them really emphasize the importance of science of reading. So teaching teachers to teach using the science of reading, requiring teacher preparation programs at universities to use it, and then also when there's professional learning for teachers, that it also emphasizes science of reading practices.
Absolutely. Well, and I think this is a good place to give context. The reason why reading is so important when it comes to education, because you can look at it as the foundation for everything else. If you can read, it builds off of that. So that is why there is such an emphasis on reading. And this is where your job comes in. I want you to lay the groundwork for us of where does Oklahoma stand right now? It's not like we are starting at square one. There has been and continues to be a lot of work on the policy level. That's kind of where everything starts and where you start to see some changes in the classroom. That's why we talk a lot about policy here. What work has been done? How can we build off of that to make some real change, to not necessarily make a miracle of our own, but start our own marathon and get us going?
Yeah. So you're right that we've been at this for some time. So people who have been involved up at the Capitol or our district leaders around the state will tell you that we've been slugging away at this actually for a number of years. Most recently, in 2024, we passed the Strong Readers Act. The Strong Readers Act places a huge emphasis on the science of reading, training teachers in the science of reading, ensuring that instruction and the materials that are being used in schools are also grounded in the science of reading. So I think that change is already ongoing and in effect, and I do think we're going to see some effects of even just those policies that have already been passed. So there's definitely some groundwork that's being done there. The law also requires that the government work with our teacher preparation programs to be able to ensure that they're also getting what they need in order to be able to teach new teachers in the science of reading or prospective teacher candidates.
So looking ahead to this year, we are a few weeks away from the next legislative session starting. And there have been some lawmakers that have said, Oklahoma has tried its own version of literacy approaches. There are some that have been somewhat successful, some not so much. So what is being done now to get these lawmakers on board with, we really need to put a focus on early literacy, capturing these students as soon as we can, as early as we can? What are some things that people can expect to see in this session that has to do with that? There's a lot.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So while we do have some core pieces in place that are very similar to the Mississippi model, there's also some core pieces that we don't have in place.
Okay.
And I think those are the pieces that will be, at the very least, looked at very carefully during the upcoming legislative session, and we may see some legislation on those. So I think the first one, the big one that you're going to hear a lot about, has to do with this idea of third grade retention or social promotion. So that's a big piece that Mississippi has. It's also a piece that a lot of other states that have modeled Mississippi, they also have that in place. And when you look, and this tends to be, there's a new term that's out there called it's the Southern Surge that people are referring to. You may have heard a little bit about that, where you're seeing states like Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee, along with Mississippi, that have implemented these packages of policies, and they're also charging ahead. And so they have a third grade retention mandate that's in place, and that one's a lot more controversial. That's a tougher conversation because a lot of people feel like if you do have to retain a child, that can have an effect on the child's self-esteem, and people worry about that. So I think that'll be up for discussion. Another piece that I think we'll be discussing during the upcoming legislative session has to do with instructional coaching. So in a lot of these other states that have been laser focused on early literacy policy, they have instructional coaches that will go out and work with teachers who are in the early grades, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, because you want retention to be a last resort.
Of course.
And so what they do is they screen students early on. They're in constant communication with parents and school leaders about how the child is doing, how their reading is either improving or not. And then the instructional coaches are out there to support the teachers in doing all that. They're modeling lessons. They're working with them on instruction. They're working with them on science of reading back strategies. And so a lot of states have done that quite well, and that's been a part of this package of early literacy policies. Our big challenge here in Oklahoma is our teacher labor markets aren't great in many areas.
Yeah, how do we find those people?
How do we find the coaches? Precisely. And the concern is if we say, hey, we're going to hire a bunch of coaches, that what we would actually do is take classroom teachers out of the classroom, make them coaches, and have them coach someone maybe who is less experienced. And that would be a little bit of a problem. So what I think we need to do with the legislative session this year is be able to figure out where does that pool, if we are going to have instructional coaches, and I hope we do, where is that pool of coaches going to come from? Now, one strategy might be to loosen our restrictions on retirement. Right now, when a teacher retires, there's some restrictions on them being able to come back and work in a school because they're on the state pension plan. So if there was perhaps a relaxing of that restriction, we could actually bring back retired teachers, highly qualified and highly capable people who are currently retired and who have a ton of experience, who could come back and be coaches and work with teachers rather than poaching good teachers from schools. So that's one strategy that I think will be looked at.
And this is where I really want to just put an emphasis on. This is part of what you do. This is your job. You look at where Oklahoma stands. You look at these problems that we have. We would like to increase literacy. What are the policies and the data that supports it that would make sense for Oklahoma? One of those being instructional coaches. Great idea. How do we make that work? And that's where you look at change the policy with retirement restrictions. For one, could be one option. There's another one that you might mention is preventative interventions. Explain that to me. What would that look like? Yeah,
so when we have our discussion about something like third grade retention, where you're going to hold a child back who is not proficient in reading, well, there needs to be a whole set of preventative interventions before that actually occurs. Third grade retention absolutely needs to be the last resort. So the way this typically, and we're already doing some of this here in Oklahoma, but the way this typically works is that you screen kids starting in kindergarten, you identify the kids who are not at grade level, and you continue to screen. You screen them in first grade, you screen them in second grade. And as you're finding kids who are not progressing where they need to be in order to be able to be on grade level in third grade, there are various interventions. So you could provide tutoring to the child within the school day. You could provide different types of instructional support with the classroom teacher working with an individual child. Some schools will provide transition years, meaning that kids who are not on grade level early on will be put into a smaller class with a highly effective teacher so that they can then catch up, and by third grade, they're ready to go. So there's a whole package of different interventions. Some of those include summer school for kids who are not on grade level. But the idea here is if we're going to start saying we're going to retain kids who aren't on grade level in third grade, that there's a whole package of different interventions that first unfold to ensure that that is very much a last resort.
Now, something else that we might see in this session is instructional days. Oklahoma has lower than average instructional days. You may not think that this could impact literacy, but it does. Make that connection for me.
Yeah, well, one thing I think your audience should know is that we're well below the national average for instructional days in most cases. Now, there are schools have a little bit of flexibility within the law on the number of days that they actually offer, but we can offer as low as 166 in-person instructional days, and most districts in the state actually do just that. They offer around 166 days. The national average is 180. If we go just north to Kansas, they actually mandate 186 days. Okay. So one thing I like to tell people is we think chronic absences is a really bad thing. If you look at the research on chronic absenteeism, that means a child who's absent for 10% or more of the school year, that their outcomes are much lower. Their academic achievement, their graduation rates are much lower. Our kids, if you take kids who are in a 166-day school district and all those kids who have perfect attendance and you suddenly plop them down in Kansas, every single one of those kids who has perfect attendance in Oklahoma would actually be considered chronically absent because they've had 166 days instead of the 186. So what's the effect of that? That accumulates over time. Over your 13 years of school, we have kids who graduate with a year and a half less. Now, the legislature, I think, has done some really good things in recent years. During the previous legislation, they limited virtual school days. They raised the number of school days that are required in the state. So this has actually had the effect of bringing back more in-person instructional days in the state, but we still have a ways to go to get to the national standard. Now, how does this all relate to reading? Well, you can imagine if you're not getting as much reading instruction, if you're getting a year and a half or possibly in some cases 2 years over the course of your entire school experience, less reading instruction than our peers nationally, well, we're not going to be competitive with our peers nationally.
Easy to make that connection there. So looking ahead, if Oklahoma gets this right, what could that mean for students? Again, Mississippi did this over a course of 10 years. There's a sense of urgency here in Oklahoma. What would it take to get it right and quick?
Yeah, well, I think as you noted, we're already on the way. We have been implementing policies, especially those backed by the science of reading. We've been screening, we've been putting interventions in place. We've got a few more to add, instructional coaching, third grade retention with support to actually get us moving a little bit quicker. But I do think we're going to start to see gains. And it's also worth stating that, none of this is actually going to be a panacea. I think we are going to see improvement, but a lot of this, it's going to require communities. It's going to require buy-in from families. We need to continue to work to improve teacher labor markets in the state because the classroom teacher is by far and away the most important school-based input. So we need to continue to do all those things. But I do think implementing good policy during the upcoming legislative session is going to help us start to see some gains. And I do think I'm very optimistic that we're gonna get there.
Oh, that was my next question. Looking at 2026, how confident are you that we'll be able to make some meaningful change at the policy level? Of course, that's just one part of it, like you said.
Well, I always try to avoid predictions or prognosticating, and I'm a political novice. I'm in this role. I mean, I'm an academic in my full-time job. But what I would say is, I'm sensing a lot of optimism around the Capitol and the House and the Senate, and of course the governor's office. Everyone wants to get something done on this. There is a sense of urgency among the legislators. So I am feeling optimistic that we are going to get some substantive policies done during the upcoming legislative session.
So how does your team at this level balance having this sense of urgency, let's get things going, but also knowing that meaningful change is not an overnight fix? If there was, we'd all be doing it, whatever that might be. How do y'all maintain that balance? What would your message be to a parent at home that's concerned about their child's education?
Yeah, well, my message to parents is parents can do an incredible amount for their child, especially when it comes to reading. So, I mean, there are numerous studies that show that parents who read to their children regularly, that when they bake in literacy activities into that reading time. So, for example, asking questions, unpacking the vocabulary with the child, doing just basic things that you might do while reading to improve comprehension and understanding can have tremendous effects. And again, doing that regularly. So parents outside of school can have a really important role in augmenting everything that's being done in school. I mean, there are so many incredible resources out there that parents can draw on the internet. Even on YouTube, I have a 5-year-old who watches a show called Alpha Blocks. It's a free show on YouTube, and it was created in a way that ensures that the instruction follows the science of reading. So I'm watching her watch the show. She's sounding out letters, and it's really neat. So there are resources like this that parents can also, it doesn't have to be just on the parent. The parent can also leverage resources in order to be able to, supercharge what their children are doing at home. And I think parents should know that we're talking about third grade retention. I can't emphasize enough that is a last resort. Parents should be thinking about reading with their children around 3, around 4, around 5. Most kids are going to be able to start reading around 5 years old if there's a lot of emphasis on that in the home. And many will be able to read even earlier. And some of that just depends on the aptitude and interest of the child. And again, the parent is very well situated to figure out what that looks like for each individual child.
It takes a village, certainly. Let's end it here. What, in an ideal situation, if Oklahoma is able to make these meaningful changes, which is the goal, what would that look like for students 5-10 years from now? Big picture.
Well, I think the hope is that if you can bolster early literacy, and you said it right at the outset, that's going to open you up to do well in many other subjects. It's very hard to do well in math if you can't fully understand the problem that you're reading. So the idea is that let's shore up what we're doing in early literacy, and that's going to allow our kids that's going to create the right foundation so that they can do well in math and science and other subject areas. And really what this ultimately should be able to enable us to do is create that strong foundation, kindergarten through 8th grade, in reading and then hopefully math, that will allow students to then go off into high school, have those baseline competencies, have those baseline academic skills so that they can start to pursue their individual interests. Very difficult to do that if you don't have a strong base in reading and math. And so hopefully what we'll do is we're going to tackle this early literacy issue, and then we have to start talking about math. So there's always work to do, but I think we're going in the right direction.
That's certainly encouraging. We'll be keeping a close eye on it throughout the legislative session. Dr. Hamlin, thank you so much for your time today and your expertise.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
We'll see you next time on Beyond the Bell. Thank you so much for tuning in today.
Beyond the Bell, brought to you by the Oklahoma Education Impact Initiative.